The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
My apologies to the class. I'm late. This will illustrate to all of you the point of Oscar Wilde's epigram, "Punctuality is the thief of time." If you hadn't come on time, you wouldn't have wasted it. Now, one of the reasons I'm late is because it took me a long time to make up my mind as to how to present the material this evening. I'm supposed to give you, according to the contract and according to the promise, a review of the latest, the most modern Yiddish poetry and prose, an undertaking which should take actually at least 25 to 30 lectures. And I've been struggling with myself as to how to present my theme, and the first thing I did was to cut it in half. That is to say, I won't have anything to do with prose. I'm going to speak to you only about modern Yiddish poetry and how to convey the essence of Yiddish poetry, not just by reading to you in English the translations of the Yiddish poems, how to get to you some of the charm of the Yiddish is the big problem. I'll give you an instance of the difficulty that there is in conveying that essential grace and warmth and intimacy of Yiddish in another language than Yiddish. You take a verse from English poetry. I happen to have chosen, I could have chosen one of 1,000, 4 lines from Kipling that many of you are familiar with in his poem Recessional, in which he talks about the fading of empire and the unimportance of human greatness in the eyes of God. And he has one of the fine stanzas reads, "The thunder and the shouting dies, the captains and the kings depart. Still stands thine ancient sacrifice, an humble and a contrite heart. Lord God of hosts, be with us yet, lest we forget, lest we forget." Now, when you read this attentively and with some knowledge of the English language, you perceive that everything that went into the making of the English language, the various sources, Old Anglo-Saxon, among which you will find words going back to the Icelandic, words that come from the Latin, through the Norman French after the conquest of England. All these are fused into a single language, and you are not aware of colorfulness and variety. But when you take a simple Yiddish poem by one of the poets I was supposed to discuss this evening, Leyelis, Glantz Leyelis. He died about less than a year ago at the age of 75 and was one of the leading modern Yiddish poets. And I've chosen from him a very simple, or apparently simple, disarmingly simple poem called A Spazier durch Lover's Lane. Now, I'm going to read the Yiddish, and I will give you a literal translation, not a poetic translation, but just a literal translation. And then I'm going to point out to you what many of you, I'm sure many of you know Yiddish quite well, some of you somewhat less well, and to some of you perhaps Yiddish is almost a strange language. I'm going to point out to you where the charm and the intimacy lie. Lovers Lane is lang geschlängelt, zieht sich bargig tollig. Lovers Lane is long and snake-like. Schlängelt is from the word schlang. Zieht sich bargig, draws itself upward on the hill, tollig, down into the valley. Lovers Lane is lang geschlängelt, zieht sich bargig tollig, und führt zu al Beis Oilem, and ends up in a cemetery. Credo unsymbolic. I am speaking here without symbolism. It means literally that Lover's Lane, where it happens to be, goes up and down, up the hill, down into the valley, and finishes up in a cemetery, and it tells you literally so. Es ist ein Yiddischer Beis Oilem, frum geplant und lieb gehovet. It is a Jewish cemetery, piously planned and tended with love. Frum geplant und lieb gehovet. Und es trug dem stolzen Nomen, and it carries the proud name von dem König David, of King David. Now let me analyze things here for you. Es ist ein Yiddischer Beis Oilem. It is a Jewish Beis Oilem. Yiddish comes from the Germanic word Yiddish. Beis Oilem is Hebraic. Frum geplant und lieb gehavet. Frum is from the German word fromm, meaning pious. Gehovet is from the Slavic. Und trug dem stolzen Namen von dem König David. Now notice, he takes a Slavic word, Gehovet, and he rhymes it with David. Now there's a strange charm in that, which still arises from the fact that Yiddish is, although an old language, fresh in our ears. We're close to it. Rund arum a cape van berglich, round about a chain of hillocks, berglich, sosnus, dembus, brezes, pine trees, oak trees, fir trees. Frumme Zweigen riechen, pious branches make a noise, über stumme Jeden gezes. Geza, it's a Hebrew word, some of you know it, meaning a tribe. Now notice, so he rhymes Berezes, which is a Russian word, with Gezes, which is a Hebrew word. And it's perfectly correct. I mean, there's nothing strained about it, there's nothing unnatural about it. At the same time, the consciousness of this multi-variety, the consciousness, the colorfulness of this variety of sources strikes one with a peculiar charm which you cannot get in English. Of course, English has other great virtues, but this particular virtue it hasn't got. And then he goes on, Die Matzeves mit die Nemmen. Die Matzeves, those are the tombstones, a Hebrew word meaning something that's being hewn out. Die Matzeves mit die Nemmen, gold und schwarze Karben. Gold in black outline. Sogen on von wie viel Länder misgekommen starben. Tell you from how many countries people came here to die. And this fact that they come from such a variety of countries adds to the force of that colorfulness and this multivariety of the languages. So here you have the interweave of the material and of the style. Then he goes on, wie es haben sich von weit gezeugen jeden Edes. Wie es haben sich von weit, how there came from afar, jeden Edes, congregations of Jews. Und nicht alle sind da geworden Mamas Sedes, and not all of them became grandmothers and grandfathers. Preplen Bemer über sie. The trees chatter or murmur over them. Elegisch und balladisch. Elegiac and in ballad style. Siehst a Gruppe in a Winkel, you see a group in a corner, herrscht a neuem Kaddish. You hear a new Kaddish. You hear balladisch, which is French, Latin, Anglo-French, balladisch rhymed with Kaddish. Strange bringing together of all the elements, telling of the various lands in which Jews have been and the various sources from which they constructed the Yiddish language. Now you remember, those of you who were present at the first of my lectures, I spoke of the structure of the Yiddish language, of the elements that went into it. And here, in modern Yiddish, in the hands of a great and skillful poet, this is all revealed for those who want to sit down and study the language intimately. I'm going to read you a poem of a man mentioned in the prospectus, Yitzhak Manger. And here I'm going to touch on another side of the beauty of Yiddish, its relationship to the spiritual, literary sources of our life, of our Jewish life. Manger had a great many styles, but he was most successful when he turned into homey, intimate, and direct portraiture the great figures of the Bible. He made Abraham and Lot and Isaac and Moses contemporaries of ours, neighbors that he happened to know. He grew up with them. They were people that he met in the marketplace. He overheard their conversation. And here he reproduces a little lecture that Abraham gave to his nephew Lot. Now, some of you will remember that Lot came to an evil end. He was a boozer. And they sometimes say that the word Lot, Lamed Vov Tes, comes from, is built up of the acronym Lot will trinken. You remember he got drunk and he begot children on his daughters. That's the famous story, how Edom and Moab, the peoples of Edom and Moab came into existence. And so Manger portrays Abraham giving a piece of his mind to his nephew Lot. Lot, ich muss dir sagen, es ist feh. Lot, I've got to tell you, it's no good, it's bad. Du schickest a jede Nacht. Erst Nächten hast du in goldenem Herrsch als a wüsten Skandal gemacht. Only yesterday in the local inn, the Golden Hirsch, you made an awful scandal. Das passt for Manger, for himself. It's all right for a man like me, he says. Das passt for Manger, dem Schneideruk. A Schneideruk, now that's a very lovely word. A Schneider is a tailor. A Schneideruk is a tailor who doesn't know his business. And a Schneideruk therefore means any man that really has no character. He says, das passt for Manger, dem Schneideruk, aber osser nicht for dir. Hast zwei Töchter megadel zu sein und bist kein ein Horror a Gewirr. You've got two daughters growing up that you've got to get married, and you're a man of some substance. This doesn't do for you. Versteh me macht a koise amol. I understand that sometimes you can take a drink. Machen a koise is a lovely Yiddish phrase. You make a cup. You make a beaker. Me macht a koise. You take a drink. Versteh me macht a koise amol. Freitag zu nachts beim Tisch. Wenn es brennende heilige Shabboslicht man esst die gefüllte Fisch. I understand that one can take a drink on Friday evening at the table when the holy lights are burning and you're going to eat the gefüllte Fish. Aber nicht wie du, not like you, Tag ein, Tag aus, day in, day out. Wie wird das ein Mensch nicht müde? How does a man not tire of drinking so much? So passt for Chavrile, dem Shabbosgoy. It would be fitting for Chavrile, the Shabbosgoy. Aber nicht for an Eid, not for a Jew. Now, he goes on in this style, which I've quoted just for the purpose of showing you how Yiddish can at once be highly complicated, highly intellectual in its poetry, and at the same time, it can be marvelously intimate. I want to give you an instance of, speaking of the variety of Yiddish. You know, there's Yiddish as it's spoken as it was spoken, or is still spoken, in Poland, in Russia, in Bessarabia. There's a poet I didn't mention in my list, whom I find irresistible in many ways, who describes and at the same time reproduces the Yiddish that was spoken in the Romanian area and the adjacent area of Bessarabia. Now, there was a great difference between the Jews of Bessarabia and, say, the Jews of Lithuania. The Jews of Lithuania were the intellectuals. They called them Tselimket. That's to say, the people with the death's heads, because of their deep sunken eyes and their long noses, they looked exactly like a death's head. The Jews of Romania, Bessarabia, and also of the Ukraine were the Fetaiden. They lived on the fat of the land, and particularly the Romanian Jews were known for their ignorance, their earthiness, their grobgate, and they were supposed to be the biggest Ferdgan of them, the most skillful horse thieves in the world. But at the same time, they were good Jews. They were thoroughly attached to the people, and this is how Auerbach reproduces their language. And I'm going to read it to you in the pronunciation of the Romanian Yiddish. Mamaligarisch Yiddish manner. Now you would say Mamaligarisch Yiddish minor, but the Romanian Jew, the unreconstructed one, I was born in Romania, I'm reconstructed. Mamaligarisch Yiddish manner, tertje van, van means vine. Mit a zip of der Zing, with a mamaligarisch Yiddish miner, Yiddish mine, filled with mamalige. Sharp wine, which gives a bite to the tongue. Beim Moldavan, beim Terken Saganer, by the Moldavan, by the Moldavian Romanian, by the Turk, and by the Gypsy. Hast du a bissl gegeben a drink. They took a little drink from each one of them to make out your Yiddish. Hast dich auf nackte Steppes gebrochen. Your skin was burned and browned on the naked steps. Winden haben zerschöbert, dann klang. The winds blew apart and blew into disorder the sound of your words. Zangen zerwickt seinen die Noten. Wheat that is swinging and swaying constitutes the notes. Ifar dein rhythm, ifar dein Gedank, both for the rhythm of your language and for the thought in your language. And it goes on. To my regret, I can't continue. I've got to go on to show you other aspects of the capacity of Yiddish, translating as I go along. Later on, in order to give you a sort of little reward for this intensive concentration, I shall read to you straight in English, but I'm going to use the first part of your energies, absorb the first part of your energies in this close analysis and demonstration of Yiddish. I'm going to read you a poem of Chaim Grader's. I'll tell you something about him first. Chaim Grader, who is still, from my point of view, a fairly young man in the 50s, has written some very great novels in Yiddish. Great novels which are descriptions and enormous panoramas of the life of Russia and Poland 30, 40, and 50 years ago. He is something like a Balzac in reproducing in these novels all of the power, the color, the energy, and the tumultuousness of life that there was in Polish and Russian Jewry before they were destroyed or partially destroyed. Like all Yiddish writers, and particularly like all Yiddish poets, particularly Yiddish poets, yes, he is aware of loyalty to the Jewish people. You won't find in English poetry, and for that matter, as far as I know, in French or German poetry, you won't find such devoted and intensive fidelity to the people itself and to its history. The Yiddish poets feel responsible for the language and feel responsible for the people. You haven't got in Yiddish, as you might have in English or German or French, I speak of the languages in which I've read poetry, you don't have simple, gifted folk singers who are illiterate. You've had some in English, or semi-illiterate. In Yiddish you have those who are acquainted with Yiddish and Hebrew and who went usually through a yeshiva education and who are acquainted with Jewish history. You may have a simple poet singing in English who is not acquainted with the long and glorious history of England. But there are no Yiddish poets who do not know all of the remote past, from the Chumash through the Talmud and the Midrash and the Middle Ages until modern times. You don't have them. Most of them, therefore, are highly learned men, and all of them are highly educated. In a case like Chaim Grader, and also in the case of Gladstein, whom I shall come to, you find the poet steeped in Jewish memories of old, and there radiates from him not just the poetry, but the warmth and the experience of a people over many, many centuries. Now here is a poem that I find highly characteristic of Grader, called Jiddische Städtlich von Polen, Jewish Städtlich of Poland. Jiddische Städtlich von Polen, geleuchten hat hier in mein Herz und Sekorn. Jewish Städtlich of Poland, you blazed, or you were illumined in my heart and in my memory, as wie mir haben in Chumash gescheint, die Mekoimes in heiligen Land. You shone upon me just as the holy places in the Holy Land shone upon my memory. Mein Kindzeit ist Borves arriber mein Heimteich, und ist mein Jarden geworden. As a child, Barefoot, I used to run across the local creek, and that became my Jordan. Der Fahr is a zinder, a chorver koistel marovi, mein itliche Wand. And therefore, for that reason, every wall that I see now, namely in the ruins of the Polish Stettlech, every wall that I see now is a Kotel Maravi. You know, that is the Wailing Wall, the remains of the temple. As we amol in Bethlehem, as once upon a time in Bethlehem, geht off in die Nacht, a gejommer van Krokke, there arises in the nights a lament from Krakow. Lublin, du hast Hals noch gechazert die Teure von Yavne. Lublin, you still went on learning the Torah of Yavne. Yavne, you remember, was the little town in which was founded the school which was to continue the Jewish tradition when Jerusalem fell. Und du bist gewesen in alle Toseftes Aboki. Now, this is highly complicated. And you were in all of the Toseftot. The Tosefta are the accompaniments, the additional material to the Talmud. A bookie, a man deeply versed in the material. Wer wird in deine Yeshivas jetzt lernen und davnen? Who will now learn and daven in your yeshivas? Ihr gute Himois von Ivretich, you good mothers of the Ivretich. I spoke to you in the second lecture, on the first lecture of the Ivretich, one of the early books in which the Jewish mother who could read would hold forth to the women assembled the Bible translated into Yiddish. Ihr gute Imois von Ivretich, Rochel und Leah von Tchinne. Tchinne was the name of the book. Gesessen seid ihr auf die Gannekes zwischen die Weiber von Stettel. You sat on the porches among the women of the Stettel. Malochem, Begleiter von Jakob, angels, the companions of Jacob. Wie wird ihr Opruge finden? Where will you find rest for your foot today? Ihr seid jetzt verormt orchem. Now you have become penniless wanderers, vermispet of Bethel, doomed to be mendicants. This gives you the richness of the style in which he develops all the memories of the folk. But I must pass on now to Levik. Now, I think most of you have heard of Ches Levik, the poet who died, I think, about 2 years ago, who, like the others, like Grada and like Gladstein, was gifted in other directions too. Levik wrote some great dramas, one of them around the character of the Golem, a magnificent drama in which the Golem runs riot and takes things into its own hands. Another, a still greater one, is in Zeiten von Iyov, in the days of Job. He writes a drama around Job and his sufferings, in which he depicts all of the anguish of Job, and at the same time draws a parallel between Job and Isaac, and goes back to an ancient midrash which says that if Job had endured his sufferings with the same equanimity as Isaac, being a boy, offered up his life to his father's knife, he too would have been one of the patriarchs. Levik lived on into the time, the Hitler time, and after it. As I say, he died only 2 or 3 years ago. He was powerfully affected by it. wrote a great deal about it. And there is noticeable in Leivik, as there is in Gladstein, a very powerful piety toward the parents. I'm going to read you later a poem of Gladstein's in Yiddish and in English of his relationship to his mother. This one is the relationship to his father. And he writes very simply, or you would say disarmingly. The theme is very powerful, in a sense even gruesome, and yet he tells it in a very matter-of-fact way. He says, "Mein Tate von jener Welt," my father from the other world, as begegnet mich, when he happens to meet me, fragt mich, was tust du da? He asks me whenever he happens to meet me, what are you doing here? Sag ich nicht, einfach nicht, gar nicht. And I don't answer him, I don't say anything. Ich hab ihm honor for sein Hand, I only snatch at his hand, for sein Benediker is very bony hand, und vier durch 7 Mal mit den Finger seine, and 7 times I make his fingers, die Keverdicke, his grave fingers, über meine Bremen, over my eyebrows, and over my lips, and over my cheeks. And nachdem, and after that, noch einmal, noch ein 7. after the 7th time, as durch meine Everim went through all my limbs, der Reich von Ewigkeit, the odor of eternity has passed through me, I say, thank you, Tata, thank you, Daddy. A second passes, and he isn't here, nicht da ihm. Menschen vorbei, wundern sich, people going by, wonder how it is, of der neuer Frischkeit, was nimmt Blien auf meine Backen, wonder at the freshness which has suddenly begun to bloom in my cheeks, of the neuer Läuterkeit, on the new purity, on the new transparency, was nimmt ruin of meine Bremen. He speaks of this contact with his father, his dead father, speaks of it as though it were a simple thing. There is something tremendous and terrifying about it, but he puts it in very simple language, which is peculiarly Jewish, or rather, we say peculiarly Yiddish. He has another poem he wrote after the time of the Treblinkas and the Majdanaks. He called the poem, Gewalt Eden seid nit mejayish. Jews, for God's sake, don't despair. I don't know how to translate the word Gewalt. I think you all know it. Gewalt, it can be used semi-comically, it can also be used in a very serious sense. Gewalt actually means a tremendous noise, means make a tremendous noise. I suppose that the nearest portmanteau translation I can give of it is, for God's sake. Gewalt Eden seid nit mejayish. Jews, for God's sake, don't despair. Also haben gerufen die Warschewer Eden in their net doigen Aufstand. That's what the Jews of Warsaw cried out to one another at the time of their rebellion, at the time of their uprising. Sie haben gerufen, sie haben die Wörter geschrieben, they called out these words and they wrote the words down. Sie haben die Aufschriften zugehangen auf Heiser. They hung up the words on various homes in the ghetto during the struggle against the Germans. Gewalt Eden, seitet mir eyes, Jews don't despair. Sie haben auch Bixen gehabt, die Warschewer Eden. They also had guns, the Jews of Warsaw. Sie haben geschossen, sie haben getroffen, die Warschewer Eden. They shot and they found their mark, the Jews of Warsaw. Und soll sein gebencht jeder idische Knoll, and a blessing on every Jewish bullet was a durchgelegt das Hart for a Nazi, which pierced the heart of a Nazi. Die Bixen haben Keulen gehabt, und die Keulen sind ausgegangen. The guns needed bullets, and the bullets ran out. Der Nazi, der Deutsch, was hat mehr gehad. The German had more, had a great deal more than the Jews. Was bedeutet dort das Wort Gewalt? What does the word Gewalt mean here, he asks. Das Wort Gewalt bedeutet doch ewig. The word Gewalt means here eternity. Nicht einmal ewig, not one time eternity, nor 7 mal 7 ewig, 7 times 7 eternal. There are other poems of Leivik in which this mission which he took upon himself to bring courage to the Jews is repeated over and over again in various forms. And it's a pity I haven't time for them, but it's just to give you, perhaps some of you will settle down to a study of Yiddish as a result of what I've told you in the last 4 lectures. I must pass on now to Yankov Gladstein, whom I personally consider, I'm not the only one, but at any rate it's my feeling, that he is by far the greatest of the living poets, and perhaps the greatest poet, and this is saying a great deal, the greatest poet that ever wrote in Yiddish. And in him, I have a book of his here called Die Liebe zum Jiddischen Wort, the love of the Jewish word. Something of what you feel. I know all of you have a little feeling of love for the Jewish word out of piety. In him, it is a tremendous passion. And he tells how he gave himself completely. He might have written in English, he commands English, came here as a young man, but he was completely absorbed in Yiddish. And he wants it that way. He says, Wer so gestellt dem Trop auf Welt, ich auf ihn. Whoever wants to can put his emphasis on the world, I on the Jew. Wird man einmal machen Tiltel für mein Lied, so people will mock at me and mock at my song, will make light of my song. Bringen Reis, as I gewesen provinziell, I will bring proof to show that I was a provincial, that I was limited because I wanted to be a Jew. Aber es wird ein jüdischer Schuljat in mein Namen sich der Mannen, but it may happen that some simple Jew going into a synagogue will remember my name, bringen für mir a Zitat, and will quote a word of mine, will quote a line of mine. Sich heraushelfen mit mein Saschure, will help himself in the way of expression with a line which I've written in 100 Jahre rum, 100 years from now. Weil meine Lefzen, wo ich will nicht schweben, then my lips, wherever I may be floating around in the universe, Zogen ehrlich and frum will say piously, das heißt aufgehen Leben, sein unsterblich. This is to be reborn, and this is immortality. To him, the fact that a Jew 100 years from now will make use of his phrase and will find comfort in a word of his means more than all the fame which he might have garnered by turning to the world at large. Now, to give you an illustration of the immense, the almost indescribable skill of Gladstein in handling the Yiddish language, and again his deep absorption in Yiddish tradition, this is difficult to explain. I want you to follow closely. He gives a description, der Bratslaver in a Nacht von Yorida. Der Bratslaver, as many of you know, was a famous Hasidic rabbi. I spoke to you about him, the genius who told all those stories the Maise mit die 7 Bettler. Well, even this genius, in spite of his egocentricity, which I described to you, had his moments of melancholy and dispiritedness when he felt himself to be not exactly the genius that he usually felt himself to be. And now look at the way the language is handled. He's speaking to himself. Ichele, visher op des nezele. Now, ichele is a contemptuous form of ich. He's speaking to himself. Ich, visher op the nose. Wipe your nose, you. So to make it contemptuous, ichele. It's the diminutive form. Visher op des nezele. Sei nicht so verrissen bei sichele. Don't be so proud of yourself. Sei nicht so verrissen bei sich. So the sichele is also put in a contemptuous form. Ichele, visher op des nezele. Sei nicht so verrissen bei sichele. Ich hab gehört sagen, du willst werden am Manig bei Iden. I've heard tell that you want to become a leader among the Jews. Lass euch zufrieden. Leave them in peace. Leave them alone. Weißt du also eins, was heißt, Id zwischen Völker? Do you realize what it means to be a Jew among the nations? Zwischen so viel Verderber und Verwelker, among so many corrupters and destroyers? Vermogst du dem Koich? Ist dein Wort der Heuben? Die Stäub von Stäuben? Have you got the strength? Is your word so exalted to lift up the dust from the dust? Ichele, nemma rois anos tichele. Little me, take out a little handkerchief for your little nose. Wax früher off und wax herein. Grow up and grow into a Yid zwischen Iden and grow into a Jew among Jews. Der Herr ist für dein großes Volk. Respect for your great people. Lass sie zufrieden. Leave them alone. Now, the point here is that in a contemptuous form, he expresses great thought. He is at the same time derisive, mocking, and behind it there is an enormous feeling for his people. Now, I've got here a poem. I don't know whether to risk it. What? I don't mean it's a risky poem. I don't mean it in that sense. But I can't translate it. Now, how many of you want me to read a poem, difficult Yiddish, really difficult Yiddish? Well, there's enough of you. Pardon? Na, wenn wir sehen, ob ihr werdet das verstehen, weil das ist schon ein bisschen gekinzelt. Here he describes a braggart, the Reiseman, he calls it, a fellow who travels, who pretends to have seen a great deal, pretends bloßt von sich, as we say in Yiddish, and he brags to everybody he's seen, but actually he's seen nothing at all, and at night in his own room he confesses to himself. Now listen to this Yiddish. Gekommen zuvor a Reiser von weit, gewesen in Wien, Berlin, China, Palästina, umgetum gewesen und umgetum gewan, als gesehen und als gesahen, der greiser, weiser Reisemann. Stellt mir auf ein edlen Gas, hast du gesehen die Zöberfass? Auf der Boden, als gesahen und als gesehen, allein gesehen das Zöberfass mit dem gildenen Äpfelquass. Erzählt also der Reisemann, gejazdet mit Wogen und gejazdet mit Bahn, umgetum gewähnen gewan und mit die eigenen Augen als gesahen. Stellt ihm ein paar Deutschland Gas und sagt ihm, mag ich Ihnen stellen eine Frage? Sagt der Reisemann, oder Rage? Mit der größten Vergnage? Mag das Deutschland so? Hast du gesehen, die Kuppene Freu? Gibt sich der Reisemann bei der Bord ein Glätt und sagt, was Schmeichel, ich mache Wett, avade wo denn, als gesahen und als gesehen, allein gesehen, die Kuppene Freu, wie ich bin ein alter Goy. Erzählt also der Reisemann, geritten auf Pferd unter der Red, gewinnen Otzen und Plotzen und Reißen und Preisen, in Ungarn, Kieren, Schuschen, Abire, mit dem Gewinnen gewahren mit den eigenen Augen als gesahen. In Schenkel, einer allein, sitzt der Reiser über ein Gläsel Wein und tracht, wo sie wird morgen sein. Alle liegen's ausgelegt, alles erzählt, alle erzählen nicht auserzählt, alle Länder ausgetracht, alle Reisen ausgedacht, am Macke gesehen und am Macke gesahen, nicht gewehen und nicht gewahren, der Greiser, weiser Reisemann. There's a skill there in handling Yiddish that no other poet, living or dead, writing in Yiddish, has ever approached. And I don't know when the genius will arise. Someday a genius will arise who will translate it into the equivalent in English. But I must confess that I tremble at the idea of undertaking it myself. Now I'm going to read to you from Yankov Gladstein a very moving poem in Yiddish. I'm going to read it through in Yiddish, then I'm going to read it through to you in English. And here I told you before that where you found in Levik that marvelous poem to his father who comes to him from the grave from time to time, and he takes hold of the hand and passes it over his lips and his cheek. Here is a poem to the mother, and first I'll read it to you in Yiddish. Die Mama von Alts, was lebt, ist gestorben. Sie verklagt sich nicht, weil Alts, was lebt, nimmt sie mit. Das ist der Sod von Sof. Gehen zu der Mammen ist nicht kein Stroff. Der ganze treuige Gezank hat a Flemmel getan mit a Schmeichel und mir ausgestreckt die verfingerte Hand mit a Dank. Hast a Mitzwe verdient. Das ist Hecher von Biker Heulen, es ist Biker Teut. Bei es ist grient wie a junge Bämel. Ist gut, was der Abschied hat noch ein Meul und Red. Morgen oder übermorgen will ich liegen leben der Mammen. A Krechts hat immer verrege verstammelt. Eingesammelt. Das meint makabel sein mit Liebschaft. Nicht geklockt, a viele mit Leube, dem gräuigen ewig, dem Zerstäube für meinen ganzen festen Charakter mit Steins gesorgt. Hat mir Hand gegeben, ein wenigen Drick. Das heißt, kommen zurück, beschollen, mit Gutsgeht, nicht zu kriegt. Liegen lebender Mammen heißt sein, eingewickt. Ich hab mir kein Keuch nicht zu trachten schwer, kein Bageer nicht to a viele vor dem letzten wackelendigen Trott zu Gott. Meine Machschobes wie von Feierfliegen der Zind a Glie in heuscheliger verschwind. Es wird auf mir beschert warme Heiligkeit, heilige Erd. Wie kann ein Mensch sein, also verdorben, kargen abgeben sein Leben, wenn seine eigene Mama ist gestorben? Ort ist der ein Zweck in Teut, starben vor der Mamas Teut. Zwei kleine Berglich, ein lichtiger Schuss, kennst es nicht verstehen, der barmdiger Gott, letzte wetigen, peinlichen, dem ungeduldigen heuten Bein. Allemann mein Gruß, lehitraut, du und du und du, eingesammelt in der worbener Ruhe. Now this is the English translation I've made. The mother of all that lives has died. But she does not complain. For all that lives, she takes with her. This is the secret of the end. To join one's mother is not punishment. The whole pitiful squabble shot up into a tiny smiling flame, and with thanks stretched out to me its 5-fingered hand. You have performed a good deed, more than visiting the sick, visiting death while he blossoms like a sapling. It is well that the leaf-taking at least has a tongue and speaks. Tomorrow or the day after, I shall lie near my mother. A deep sigh brought a passing stammer into his speech. To be gathered in, that means to accept with love, unlamenting, even with praise, the grassy eternity, this crumbling into dust of my firm, massive, characteristic self. God save the mark. He held me in a bony handshake. This means homecoming, in peace, in goodwill, not at odds. To lie near one's mother means to be cradled to sleep. I no longer have the strength for heavy thinking, not even the desire for the last tottering step toward God. My thoughts kindle like fireflies, a flicker and a falling into blackness. There waits for me foreordained warm sanctity, holy earth. How can a man be so vile as to begrudge his life when his own mother has died? There is your purpose in death, to die for your mother's death. 2 little mounds, a shining of grace. You understand it well, God of compassion. Last pains torment the rebellious flesh. To all greeting, lehitraot, to you and you and you. Ingathered to merited rest. Now I'm going to close on that note before we have question and discussion, because I consider that one of the great poems of the Yiddish language, and I want to finish, although I have a great deal more material, I want to finish with Gladstein, to leave him closest in your mind, because I consider him the genius of this age, and in Yiddish perhaps of all ages. Now, have you got some questions? Or? Yes. Pardon? Of Israel, you mean the editor of Slutsky? Lutsky. Do you mean the editor of the Golden Decade? What poem do you mean?
It was a Jewish poem by the name
Lutsky. No, I don't. Er is wenig bekannt. No. Where did he publish? Where did he write? Here in America? Pardon? In the Tog? No, I don't know his point.
The reason I mention it is because you mentioned Gladstein showing why he didn't the Jewish word.
Mm-hmm.
And Lutzky was phenomenal in this respect. If you take a plate of brass and describe its flow and use Jewish words which were phenomenal, very descriptive.
Strange, I haven't come across it. Has he been published in books?
Oh yes, he used to sell it in the company homes, so that they all sell his own books. But he was known in Jewish circles.
I don't know his poetry. Bitte? What? Was? Komt runter. Was sagt ihr? Ich kenne sie nicht. No, ich kenne sie nicht. Well, here's a poet, a Yiddish poet that I don't know. Uh-huh. Well, I don't know them. I must become acquainted with them. Yes? Oh, Avram Raisin. He is one of the, I would call him in Yiddish poetry, one of the primitives among the moderns. That is to say, he certainly doesn't belong to the moderns in the same sense as the men I've just spoken about, but he certainly is more modern, let us say, than a rhymester like the man who wrote. Who is the man who wrote the famous Badchen, who wrote the? Sorry, the name escapes me. 2 volumes of his appeared recently.
Somebody said Zunzer.
Zunzer, thank you very much. Zunzer belonged to the old world. He was the modern among the old ones. Raisin is the old one among the moderns. See, among the first. He wrote always about the poor and about the oppressed. You remember a poem of his called A gesindeles acht und betten nur zwei. Es kommt an der Nacht wie schloppen den See. 3 mit den Taten und 3 mit der Mammen, händlich und fieslich geflochten zusammen. Es kommt an der Nacht und die Mama geht betten, fangt sie an dem Teut auf sich betten. Narische Mama, das ist doch ein Wunder. Euch in Kever ist eng und dort schloft man besonder. Now, this is the kind of intimate poetry of the people that he wrote, and the short stories too. But, of course, there's a whole world, and I'm not acquainted with all of this. Slutsky, for example, here I'm not acquainted with at all. Pardon? Manuel. Yes, of course, he's among the first. A great lyric poet. And you know a man who's now forgotten and who was a first-rater, Moshe Leib Halpern. He's forgotten him. Now, Moshe Leib Halpern, Manuel Leib, I remember a poem as it begins, in dem Ormland von Litte singt der Vogel in a Schmitte, in der Fahr auf jeden Rog singt der Dallas jeden Tag. Singt der Dallas und der Eulem singt mit ihm auf alle Kehlen. He wrote about the poverty of Lithuania, the intellectual land. Moshe Leib Halpern, one of the most powerful and one of the most brutal poets. He liked to represent himself as a grober Jung, which he wasn't. He was an intellectual. I remember a poem of his, now you mention him, he said, no, I'll just come to him a little bit later. So wait just a moment. Also wie mir viel zu Aponnen vom Feuer verbrennt, also wie mir viel zu ein Mensch, was hat Orms anhängt, also viel ich Mitleid und Ekel zum jüdischen Weib, was lost von a goyischer Hand sich barrieren das Leib. 2, 3 Mal spei ich heus, wenn geh vor a Kloster vorbei. Als irgendwo gekannt, wird ich speien mit glühendem Blei auf Kinder, was trocken in ihre Bluten, die sind von jüdische Töchter, was schlafen mit goyische Hint. That's a powerful thing. Now, the range of expression in Yiddish poetry is enormous. And then poems like Bialik's Unter der Grieninke Bemelach. Most of you know that poem anyhow. It was such a charm and such a grace. You know, strangely enough, Bialik is neglected as a Yiddish poet because he overshadows himself as a Hebrew poet. But as a Yiddish poet, he's in the very first rank. And he too knew how to weave together these strange rhymes of the Slavic and Germanic with the Hebraic to produce those startling, colorful effects. There's a poem of his which he put as a sort of introduction to his own Yiddish translations. glust sich mir wenig Geschmacker von Herzen, zieht mich wie Chmares zum Jamm, zu dem Schwarzen, tiefer zu euch, meine ellende Brüder. Ich weiß euch a Träer von meiner eigenen Mammen, beuert dem Tohom dort von eurer Jammen und bängt auf sie stille Red noch meine Lieder. Mammen und Jammen. And then he goes on. Und Pharisäer von eintige Chmares wird uns verbleiben an Neuer al-Naharis. How do you like the rhyme? Eintige Chmares, which is a Slavic word, al-Naharis, which is from the 137th Psalm. You remember? Al-Naharis, Bobo Sham Yishabnu Gambachidus. Und Pharisäer von eintige Chmares wird uns verbleiben an Neuer al-Naharis, was wird Himmel und Erde verkehren. Glücklich ist der, und gebencht soll werden, was wird verewigen eure Tränen, heilige 2000-jährige Tränen. He could write that side by, as it were, side by side with, unter de Grinike Bemelach, spielen sich Meuschelach Schlemelach, Zitzes kapottkelach Peelach, Idelach frisch von die Ehelach. Charm. Yes. I've come across, yes, I've come across. I don't know, but I don't know it by heart. Yes, yes, I can imagine that it would be. Are there questions that you'd like to ask? I beg your pardon? Well, Moshe Nadi was a very clever satirist. I wouldn't put him in the same class with the men I've just spoken about, but he was very clever. He had some very brilliant sketches. He has one of a man who was always trying to commit suicide. First he would turn the gas on, and then he found he couldn't breathe, so he turned it off. Then he wanted to hang himself, found it choked him, and then he tried other methods. His wife flew into a rage. He said all the money he was wasting, du mit dein chaserischen Selbstmord ruinierst uns. Somebody asked a question there? I beg your pardon. Pardon? Yehoash, yes. He's one of my favorite. I've got poems of his here. If you want to, no, I haven't got them, but if you want to hear, I'll read you some poems of Yehoash. In English, I won't torture any, those of you who don't know. What? Comes in it in Yiddish, though. I brought the English as a zuckerleckechel for those who... to show you the variety that there is in Yiddish. A poem of Leivik has been, Yehoash was a great scholar and made a remarkable translation of the Tanakh into Yiddish. It's one of the sources of classical Yiddish. And he wrote with simplicity, and he had none of the Kunsten of a Gladstein. He didn't have that marvelous ingenuity, that Dreidlichen, Spitzlichen, Kunsten. But he had a great sense of humor. And one of his poems I've got here in translation. This is not my translation. This is a man called Goldstick. Made it quite a nice translation. It goes like this. A waggish horse that had returned from town brought tidings he had learned about an act just promulgated which attacked and banned all ritual slaughter, inspired by an anti-Jewish plotter. The story came to pass in Lithuania, though some say it was in Romania. Forthwith he was surrounded by a horde of cows and sheep and goats and ducks and cocks and turkeys who, in notes peculiar to their kind, the horse implored, Oh, do repeat the news, and don't withhold a thing you know. And when the horse had thrice retold what he had heard, each time appending new enhancing details, all were stirred and faces were aglow with joy. At last a curse had come upon their ancient foe, and old and young just itched to celebrate right lustily this day of days. The cock broke out in rhyming verse. The melody was borrowed from the Marseillaise, and most words too. The song ran thus in part: "Come, children of the pen, regale your heart, the day of glory has ascended, the Shochet's ruthless might is ended." A gallant turkey gobbler, he engaged as partner for a dance a buxom goose he spied by chance. 2 ducklings showed their petticoats while wobbling with alacrity, and oxen, lambs, and billy goats kept hoofing the quadrille as if they couldn't hop their fill. Straightway the horse exploded in a jeering neigh, and thus addressed the laughter-shaken gay crowd: "It seems you are mistaken about this new event. I merely meant to draw the fact to your attention that the law just said, instead of being slaughtered with the shochet's blade, the axe shall strike you down and kill, or else a club will serve. Convenience will decide the tool. Why then this frenzied hubbub? New methods are no aid to your longevity. They just replace the old. You'll lose your life in any case." That gives you, by the way, some of the charm of the original. If you want to stay, I'll read you some more. Yes, you want to stay? All right. Now, those of you who are very hungry, for other things, I'd like to read to you something. Again, this is a difficult one, from a poet that I haven't mentioned, I ought to have mentioned, Auerbach. Those of you who must go, please do, but don't go out in the middle of the poem. Just leave now if you have to. I don't know how many of you have come across this poem in the Yiddish. All right, we all settled? This is called Herschela Astropolier. The name is familiar. Kent him. You kent dem Wocher. Aid wie Herschela Astropolier, was pechnet 7 Tage a Woche von Hunger, wollt lieber ist bei der Rube Cholien und nicht gepläudert und gesungen. Negidim sind da und Barabatem nicht kosche, Stott ist noch nicht heftiger. Nur Herschela sagt Tamavata, als Finger sind bei se Lepke. Wie sollen sie ihm zuwerfen a Breckel, als von de schönen Iden macht Häusig. Reb Salmen sagt putzt sich wie a Teckel. Reb Zender sagt kämmt sich und ist läusig. In grad ist Herschela Ida Landen, der Fahrestag mehr verdrossig. A Blum bagrum unter Milbersanden ist dort dacht sich auf dem Apossig. An Nimmelten hat die Bäckische verlattet, mit reut Gewand, a Spitzel mit a Redel, und gleich zu Misrach, zu den Balabaten, wie nicht da gedacht, das reute Schädel. Versteht sich, es ist geworden am Ume, die Balabaten sind blech geworden, und Herrscher darf noch zu dem Rummel mit Redsee stechen wie a Dorn. Weil immer Herrscher, ne Gidem schachert, mit Sackreut füllt sich die Steugen, nur Ochsen sind hier voll mit Pachen, als tut auch reuter Flatter vor die Augen. A schöne Memre Schabbos noch Egbe. So hat Montag Herrscher nicht abgeschnitten drucken. Man sagt, dass 2 Chadoshim Jakbe ist noch gewesen nach Chile Mesucken. Nur Mentius hat gelernt. Verdart, vergelt, zerkarawatschet und schreit, ich will allein sich wehren gegen unsere Marbarawasches. Ach, Herrscher, Aidam Mufflig, die Stadt wird dir gegeben, bitte, abi beim Öfen in dein Stublig, abi dein Covid abzuhieten. So kommt einmal ihm an, Asaman Kolja, und läuft zu der Miel beim Brickel und hebt uns singen über Astropolie, a Woloch oder a Chazone-Stickel. Beim Herzen dämmt es wie Kol Nidre, die Welt ist voll erzündet Rachmen. Nur Tekef, retter dir Kapidrich, hat sich jeder hat sie Jachmert. Die bräune Augen seine sehst du, wie nicht von der Welt auf dir spucken, wie stille Vögel von den Nesten, als will der Sparber sie verzucken. Und rett auf Nantaken, auf wüste Felder soll es fallen, wird gehen zum Rov in Heule Gattkis und vor der Tiere Chazerkoilin. So it goes on. This man too, as I should have given more space to, but and I'll give you a last one of a poet who died several years ago, who wrote very tenderly, is not among the great poets, but who brings back very gently the mood of the past. Mark Schweid. I don't know how many of you remember him. And this is a poem in memory of his childhood, in memory of the days when he lived in the village not far from the Guten Eden. Das doseke Lied ist verraschalisch Sudes von meiner erweiterten Kinderjahren in dem Gärstiebel auf der größer Gass und vor einem Lave Malke bei mein Mammen der Almone lange Jahren noch mein Tatensteut. Für ein Tag Schabbos, non von Ben Aschmosches, bin ich einer allein in a fremder Gass, a frisch gegolter, in ein ausgeputzter wie a Goy, gesessen in a griechischer Gorkirch, gegessen scharfe Grinsen, großen, gemildete mit Wolven und Bäumen, und ein gegen mir beim nicht bedeckten Tischl ist halb gesessen und halb gestanden und ohne Appetit mit mir mitgegessen, mein Ummet, der Hüter von meinen beweglichen Sekunden. Bis jetzt noch gedenk ich, als ich mit Baren Silber per Zort verzweien, Gott schleuten Cheshben ist mir damals ausgekommen, als ich bloß bezahlt für mein Ommetswohlzeit. Und spät bei Nacht von jenem Schabbos, mit einer leichtsinniger Chavrusse, beim rüten Fleisch und schlechten Wein, aber getrunken, gegessen und gesungen, und für ein Chava zu der rechten Hand bekloppt sich auf den Morgen, und der Chava zu der linken hat mich aufmerksam gemacht, als mein Beefsteak ist zu roh, ich soll ihn besser mehr nicht essen, weil die Augen meine sind voll mit Tränen. Jorndig Pamelech ist mir von Sekorn abgewischt geworden die Schönkeit von der Heim. Und der Chalessudes und der Malavamalke singen noch in mir als stiller weiter wie der reiche Reich von Wieglieder in einer erwachsenen Kindssekorn. Viel von denen.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.